Sure. Here's a gripping, natural-sounding introduction for your YouTube story. I always thought I knew everything about my best friend, Jake. We grew up together, spent countless weekends at each other's houses, and told each other everything. Or at least, I thought we did. His mom, Mrs. Carter, was always around, always kind, and always had this warm, almost too perfect smile. She was the kind of person who never let anything seem wrong, always offering cookies when we got home from school and laughing at our dumb jokes. But looking back, I realize now that sometimes people who seem the happiest are the ones hiding the biggest secrets. It all started one weekend when I crashed at Jake's place, like I always did. Nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. We played video games, messed around on our phones, and talked about school drama. But that night, something strange happened. I woke up thirsty and went downstairs to grab a drink. As I passed the hallway near Mrs. Carter's room, I heard something, muffled voices, almost like an argument. But what caught my attention wasn't the voices themselves. It was the panic in her tone. I knew I shouldn't eavesdrop. It wasn't my business. But there was something about the way she whispered, like she was afraid of being heard. My heart pounded as I crept closer. That's when I caught a few words that sent a chill down my spine. They can't find out. It'll ruin everything. Who was she talking about? What couldn't be found out? A million thoughts rushed through my mind, but I told myself I was just overthinking. Maybe it was just something personal, something about work or a family issue. I grabbed my drink and hurried back upstairs, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my chest. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Mrs. Carter acted normal, smiling as she made us pancakes, laughing at our jokes, like nothing had happened. But now, that smile felt different, forced, like she was trying too hard to keep up the act. I wanted to believe I was just being paranoid, but then, later that day, I accidentally stumbled upon something that made it impossible to ignore. I was looking for a charger in the living room when I noticed a small locked drawer in the TV stand. I had never seen it before, and maybe I wouldn't have thought twice about it, if not for what happened next. As I pulled out some random cables, the drawer shifted slightly, and something slipped out, a folded piece of paper. Without thinking, I picked it up. The second I saw what was inside, my hand started shaking. My stomach dropped. And at that moment, I realized Mrs. Carter wasn't just keeping a small family secret. This was something much, much bigger, and I had just stepped into the middle of it. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Who was this other person, and why did Mrs. Carter have a document that looked so secretive? My brain raced through possibilities. Was it a legal issue? My hands felt clammy as I stared at the folded piece of paper. I knew I shouldn't look, that it wasn't mine to read, but my curiosity was too strong. With shaky fingers, I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words. At first, they didn't make sense. It was an official-looking document, but certain details stood out. Mrs. Carter's name was on it, but there was another name, too. One I had never heard before. And then, near the bottom, there was a date. Years before Jake was even born. Hidden family connection? Something she didn't want Jake to know? None of it made sense, but the one thing I knew for sure was that she had been desperate to keep it hidden. I quickly folded the paper back up and slid it into the drawer, making sure it looked untouched. My heart was still pounding when I heard footsteps approaching. I barely had time to move away before Mrs. Carter appeared in the doorway. "You okay?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes studying me. "Yeah," I mumbled, pretending to fidget with the charging cable. "Just looking for this." She smiled, but I noticed the way her fingers twitched slightly, like she was nervous. "All right, let me know if you need anything." I nodded, forcing myself to act normal as she walked away. But in that moment, I realized something. She had seen me near the drawer, and if she knew I had found something, would she try to cover it up? The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. Jake and I went outside, played basketball, and even watched a movie. But my mind kept drifting back to that piece of paper. I wanted to tell Jake, to ask if he knew anything, but what if he didn't? What if this was something even he wasn't supposed to know? Later that evening, as we sat on the couch, Mrs. Carter walked in, holding her phone tightly. Her face was calm, but I noticed her eyes flicker toward the TV stand for the briefest second. That's when I knew. She was checking. She was making sure the paper was still there. A chill ran through me. She wasn't just hiding something. She was afraid of someone finding out. And now I was part of it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind kept going back to that paper, to Mrs. Carter's nervous glance, to the way she had paused for just a second too long when she saw me near the drawer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. But the worst part? I had no idea what it actually meant. The next morning, Jake's dad, Mr. Carter, came home from a business trip. He was the kind of guy who was always busy, always on the phone, barely around. But this time, something about him seemed different, more on edge. At breakfast, he barely said a word, just kept checking his phone, his jaw clenched tight. Even Jake noticed. "Everything okay, Dad?" he asked between bites of cereal. Mr. Carter looked up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just work stuff." But his eyes flickered toward Mrs. Carter for the briefest moment, and that was when I saw it. A silent exchange between them, quick, but loaded with meaning, like they both knew something and were choosing not to say it. That's when I started to wonder, was this secret just Mrs. Carter's, or was Mr. Carter involved too? Later that day, while Jake was outside, I went back inside for some water. As I passed by the home office, I heard hushed voices, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, talking fast, almost arguing. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught pieces. "It's too risky. We can't keep this up forever. What if someone finds out?" My stomach dropped. It wasn't just some harmless secret. This was something serious, and whatever it was, they were terrified of the truth coming out. I backed away from the office door, my heart hammering. I didn't know what I had just stumbled into, but I could feel it. Something was about to crack. The way Mrs. Carter had whispered, the way Mr. Carter's voice had tightened. They weren't just worried, they were scared. And if they were scared, it meant whatever they were hiding wasn't just some harmless secret. I tried to act normal when Jake came back inside, but my mind was spinning. Should I tell him? Should I pretend like I hadn't heard anything? Before I could decide, Mrs. Carter called out from the kitchen. "Hey, could you grab something from my car for me?" Her voice was light, casual, but I could hear something underneath it, a forced calm. I hesitated. Sure." The moment I stepped outside and opened her car door, I saw it. A manila folder sitting on the passenger seat, papers sticking out of the edges. My stomach twisted. I knew I shouldn't, but my hands moved before I could stop myself. I picked it up, flipping it open just enough to see the first page. As I handed her the keys, she held my gaze for a second too long. She knew. She knew I had seen something. It was another document, the same unfamiliar name I had seen before, but this time there were more details, an address, a different last name, and then something that made my breath catch, Mrs. Carter's signature at the bottom, right next to the word legal guardian. Footsteps. I barely had time to shove the folder back into place before Mrs. Carter appeared at the doorway. She smiled, but I saw it, the flicker of suspicion in her eyes. "Did you find it?" she asked. I swallowed hard. Yeah, here." And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This secret, whatever it was bigger than I had thought. And now, I wasn't just an outsider who had overheard too much. Now, I was involved. As I stood there, trying to keep my face neutral, Mrs. Carter's expression shifted. It was subtle, but I saw it. The flicker of calculation, like she was trying to decide if she should say something or pretend nothing had happened. Then, just as quickly, the warm smile returned. "Thanks," she said, her voice steady. "Jake's in the backyard if you need him." I nodded and walked off, but my mind was racing. She knew, and the worst part? She wasn't panicking. She was thinking, planning, like she had been in this situation before. I found Jake outside, shooting hoops, completely unaware of what had just happened. I wanted to tell him everything, but before I could, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a blocked number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to pick up. I stepped away and answered. "Hello?" A pause, then a deep voice, unfamiliar and cold. "You need to stop digging." My stomach dropped. "Who is this?" Another pause, then a quiet, almost amused chuckle. "Just walk away. Forget what you saw. It's not your problem." The line went dead. I stood frozen, my pulse pounding. This wasn't just about a secret anymore. Someone else was involved. Someone who knew I had seen something I shouldn't have. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I noticed something that made my breath catch. Mrs. Carter, standing by the window, watching me. She knew about the call. Or worse, she had something to do with it. I suddenly felt trapped, like I had stepped into something way beyond my control. And now, I wasn't just trying to uncover the truth. I was trying to stay safe. I knew I couldn't just ignore the call. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare me. They were warning me. But the question was why? What was so dangerous about Mrs. Carter's secret that someone thought I needed to walk away? I couldn't. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I crept downstairs. My hands were shaking as I reached for the locked drawer in the TV stand. I had to know the truth. This time, I didn't just find the document. I found something else. A photo tucked behind the papers. My breath caught as I pulled it out. It was an old picture of Mrs. Carter, but she wasn't alone. She was standing next to a younger man, holding a baby. At first, I assumed it was Jake as a baby, but then I noticed something. The date in the corner of the photo. It was before Jake was born. A chill ran through me. This wasn't about Jake at all. This was about someone else. Just then, I heard movement behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. Mrs. Carter stood in the shadows, her face unreadable. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "Who is he?" I held up the photo. "Who's the baby?" She hesitated, then sighed. "My son." I felt dizzy. "But, Jake, he's not my first." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I had another child, but I had to give him up, for his safety." Before I could process what she meant, my phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. Mrs. Carter's face darkened. "If they're calling you, it means they've found him." And just like that, I realized this wasn't over. A heavy silence filled the room as Mrs. Carter stared at my phone, her expression unreadable. My heart was racing, my mind struggling to piece everything together. She had another son, someone she had hidden. And now, whoever had been calling me, they knew where he was. Mrs. Carter suddenly snapped into action, grabbing her phone and dialing a number. She turned away as it rang, her voice urgent when someone finally answered. "It's me. They found him. We don't have much time." She hung up and looked at me, her mask of calm finally breaking. "You need to forget all of this," she said, "for your own safety." I wanted to push for more answers, to understand why she had kept this secret for so long, but deep down, I already knew. She wasn't a bad person. She was a mother protecting her child. And whoever was after him, they weren't going to stop. A car pulled up outside. A man I had never seen before stepped out, his face grim. Mrs. Carter grabbed her coat and turned to me one last time. "Tell Jake I love him," she said softly, "and tell him I'll be back." Then, just like that, she was gone. Jake never got a full explanation. His mom called days later, saying she had to take care of something important. He believed her. Maybe it was better that way. I never told him what I knew. Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered. But sometimes I wonder, where did she go? Who was she running from? And most of all, will she ever really come back? I guess some mysteries don't have clear endings. Some just leave you waiting.